Thanks very much, John. Thanks very much, John, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen, ministers. Great honor to be here this morning presenting to you. I think I'll win some time because I'll just use Bruce's introduction of what he's been showing us, telling us about it, because that's essentially what we want to talk about this morning. Do we still believe there's growth? I think in the industry and in agriculture, from our side, the agriculture that I've had a lot of exposure to on the grain and oilseed side, we had a lot of growth, and agriculture has been growing. I know in the citrus industries, there have been tough times. If you look at agriculture in general, agriculture has actually been the shining light. If you look at the analytics, agriculture is the only sector, if you look at pre-COVID, post-COVID, it's a sector that has expanded by 25%. So clearly, it's a relatively small sector, but has been extremely positive and has grown fast. And the question is, how do we navigate and how do we get to our biggest strategic goals despite of all these interactions, of all the conflict, the COVID supply chain disruptions, the infrastructure challenges? We have the weakening police, and rural security is a big issue for farmers. Climate change, a longer-term strategic issue, but we have short-term volatility that has a huge impact on the industry. So how do we get to this, ensure that this plan, and Minister, we have a plan, we have a good master plan. So Bruce, I don't know whether you're still here, but agriculture has a plan. We have a good plan, and we've spent a lot of time on it, on this plan, and all the role players have been involved in forging this plan. So there is a plan. How can we still maintain our strategic goal, our vision, our alignment, and actually execute on the plan while still managing to survive and getting through all these short-term crises? So electricity, a lot of been said around electricity. I think the point that I just want to make, agriculture is an electricity-intensive industry. So just look at that graph there. This gives us the highest, so it essentially gives you the highest use to value added. In other words, how much electricity does the agriculture sector use relative to its output? And there you can see agriculture is one of the big energy users in relative terms to what it's putting out there. So very sensitive towards the shocks that are coming our way. And if we look at if we do the calculation, how much of agriculture is dependent on electricity, or specifically on irrigation, 33% of farming income is dependent on irrigation. So this is a big number, and this irrigation is obviously being influenced. This is the type of work that we're also putting into the task team currently, just trying to understand which are the industries, where are they situated, and who are the big energy users, and how can we actually facilitate that? But in short, 33%, and that excludes the electricity that's used for the livestock-intensive industries, your dairies, etc. So this is a very busy graph, but the principle around all of this is electricity is not only at the primary level. Left top-hand side of your chart, that's the primary producer. The consumer sits on the bottom right-hand side. So sometimes, in some of the papers I read suggestions around competition, unfair competition, or monopolistic behavior, and then there are suggestions around primary sector. You know, there should be export taxes to drive down prices. And you think about the structure. I wish I could sit with these people and just explain to them, how does a food system work? Where are all the cost components? We maybe have in the final product of something like maize meal, which is the most basic product, only 50% of those costs come from maize. The rest is all in the supply chain. And the more your product evolves, the bigger are the costs. So wherever if you have an issue at the ports for exports, or an issue at the ports for imports, for processing, it's all about the cost buildup in the value chain. And we need the interventions across the value chain to get to the real issue at hand, and that's food inflation. So we are currently running at a food inflation of 13.4%. If you take that graph back a little bit, Those first 2 or 3 bars there, that's 2019, 2020, 21. So colleagues, we are in the normal years, let's say pre the shock of the war, we were very much in line, our food inflation, with the US, with Brazil, with EU. And then suddenly we had this shock. So look where we are currently at 13.4%, but there's a very interesting trend in our food inflation compared to the countries that we normally are in line with. Look at the US inflation coming down, Brazil inflation coming down, even our colleagues in Zambia inflation slightly coming down. So exchange rates do play a big role, but we still have rising inflation. So one could argue there's a bit of a lagged effect, but all of these countries have lagged effects in food inflation. It's the additional costs that are sitting in our supply chain. So, and if you've been reading about those, the generators that need to run, the infrastructure that's more expensive, that's not holding, and that's feeding into our food inflation. Why is this important? For all of us in the room, with all respect, food inflation of 13.4%, it's hefty, but that's not where the big crisis lies. The big crisis lies with 50% of our households that spend about 32% of their income on food. And if we just look at a basic food basket, we call this the BFAP thrifty, healthy food basket. If you, a family of 4, if you would like to afford a basic thrifty food basket, it costs you 3,400 Rand a month. Now, that 32% is if we take 2 minimum wages and if we take child grants and a pension in the house into consideration. 32%. And that has increased by 400 Rand a month over the last year. So colleagues, that's where our challenge lies. And that's the value of agriculture in terms of the food security. Yes, we're producing enough food, but the affordability becomes a big, big issue. Another dynamic or a mega trend that we need to take into consideration, and that in terms of the plans and the solutions, the fact that our population is urbanizing. We have the greatest concentration of low-income households is in rural areas. So yes, agriculture can play a role in rural areas for household income. But the biggest number of low-income households are in urban centers, and that number is increasing. So what do we need for that, to address that issue? There we need the commercial supply chains. We need highly effective commercialized supply chains that can feed the growing population in the urban centers. So just if we take a broad look at, in terms of the outlook, what are we projecting currently? And this is now in line. If you would take the OECD, FAO projections, and we just have a look at what has happened to South African agriculture GDP in real terms. Look at that rapid growth, and this is now the total ag sector on the right-hand side, and I'll get to the split out on horticulture, field crops, and livestock in a moment. But if you just keep an eye on the right-hand side, that circle, that's what has happened to agriculture over the last 3-4 years. We've been blessed with good rain, higher prices due to partly the war, and this is where it comes in. On the right-hand side, look at field crops. This big rapid growth has mainly come from field crops. That's the blue line. Look at the orange line. That's the horticulture sector. So for the last 3 or 4 years, it's been tough times in horticulture and livestock. Bits of ups and downs. So whenever there's an AI, when there's a swine fever, it hits the market, but then there is some form of rebound in that market. So the biggest growth has certainly come from field crops. That's what we've seen, the sharpest growth. So if Umkali, this is if for those citrus farmers who also have mealies and soybeans, then you paid your citrus bill with the mealies and the soybeans. The question is where to from here? So we're already seeing global prices coming down. If we feed those in, and again, as long as the war continues, we'll see higher energy prices. That's a fact. But what we also need to take into consideration, global producers are responding to higher profit margins. So if you see the US, they're expanding production. If you think about China, interestingly enough, China is talking about starting to produce or to allow GMO production. If China starts to produce GMO, that's certainly going to have an impact on global production of agriculture. So the question is, how do we anticipate this decline and how do we mitigate for it? That's on the total agriculture side. If we think about horticulture, and this is my colleague Tracy Davis, she's going to talk about it tomorrow in a lot more detail on citrus, because your trend looks different than the grain trend. So, but from agriculture perspective in total, this is what we currently have, growth that is relatively subdued. And the question is really, how can we change this? How can we change the baseline that looks at relatively subdued growth to all the factors that Bruce, Andre, that you guys have been mentioning? How can we change that picture? And it requires targeted reforms and innovation and investments. And that's what we've been talking about this morning, and we've been talking about it for the last 18 months or 20 months, 24 months in the master plan. So the question is, how do we move from 1,000 rand a hectare to 1,000,000 rand a hectare, if I can put it in simple terms? Because that's essentially what the horticulture industry has done. Just have a look from 2010 to 2020, that horticultural line. In 2010, horticulture's turnover was almost the same size as field crops. And then field crops essentially moved sideways. There were some ups and downs, but essentially moved sideways. Look at horticulture growth. That was a mega expansion in export-orientated high-value crops like citrus. So major, major investments, and that's why I took that picture up in the Northern Cape, and it was literally the amount that it went to R1,000,000 more per hectare to get these high-value crops established. If you think about that expansion, it's about 130,000 hectares. If you multiply that by, let's say, roughly 800,000, R1,000,000 a hectare, that's a big investment. That was all coming from private sector to drive, to capture this growth in the market. So making a case for investments in agriculture value chains, there's no other way around this. We need to get our investments going. We need to grow. There's no other way around it. We cannot stagnate. Our competition is moving. So, and for this, we need to understand our agriculture and agro-processing in context. So agriculture, if we just do a broad stock take, 40,000 commercial farmers. Now that I would say VAT-registered farmers, because we also have commercial farmers that are selling surpluses in that 200 to 300,000 emerging farmer group. We have 2.5 million households. So this is all from the census data. We know there's more. We need to interpret those numbers carefully because some of them are VAT-registered farmers, as I mentioned. Some are commercial farmers that are selling surpluses, and agriculture is their prime income. So our numbers, we need to go and look at our numbers and ensure that we have the correct stats. The bottom line is that's a section on primary sector. If we look at agro-processing, we have about 4,700 commercial processing firms. Now that turnover, just compare that turnover, 546 billion versus 330 billion. So obviously we have an industry beyond the farm gate. And this is what's unique to the South African agriculture or the economy compared to our neighbors. A lot of times we hear in these in debates, and John, and Minister, we had those debates in the master plan where we said our agriculture sector's contribution, we are different than in Africa. If you look at Africa, Uganda, Ethiopia, Tanzania, look at that primary agriculture, that green bar. They are sitting at 25-30% contribution to their economy. South Africa is sitting at 1.5-2%. It's a completely different ballgame. And that's not a bad thing. I think that's a good thing. So we have a big market, but we're already outproducing our market. So the value lies beyond the farm gate. Look at that section, the orange and the yellow that goes beyond the farm gate. So we already have that in place. We already have the manufacturing. We already have the upstream and the downstream value chains. And for us, that's a huge opportunity. And specifically an opportunity for transformation. So our farmers, if we think about the upliftment of smallholder farmers, getting new black farmers into the market, we have the commercialized value chains. We have the support services that we need to leverage on. Our picture does not look like our African neighbors. And with all respect, there's still a lot that we can learn from our African neighbors. But our economy runs differently, completely differently, and we need to take the opportunity for that. I always show this picture. We recently did this work for the pork industry, and just reiterating the fact that we don't really measure accurately. Colleagues, this was on the left-hand side. You see the formal the pork market or the pork industry as you would see it often in the media, or that's what's talked about. Only 170 producers, 1.4 million pigs. And this is the concentration map. It's in Gauteng and it's in the Western Cape. On the right-hand side, we started to work through data that is available on household level data. Sometimes it's not in agriculture where you find the data and where you get these insights and what's really important. There are 208,000 households that report they have 10 pigs or more. So we went to those households, we did the surveys, and we wanted to understand the little economy behind these little pig operations, because that's what they are. They are selling surplus meat. These are commercial little operations. And if we look at the revenue that they were generating, it's about 23,000 jobs in minimum wage level. So we are not measuring these informal economies well, and we need to do a lot more on that. And that's also part of the black farmer share in production, that we're not measuring accurately. So we need to understand it, and we need to support these value chains where we can, but certainly there's a lot more happening than what we're measuring. So Andre, you talked about the economy, so agriculture, just on the GDP side, we are at the lower level, but we are almost double the figures for employment. So agriculture is about 6% of our country's employment, and agro-processing about 2%. What I wanted to show you here, these are a lot of busy graphs, but I just wanted to highlight a few facts on the right-hand side around what's happening in employment in agriculture. Because it has been a space where we have things that are not right on the employment side in agriculture. But I wanted to show you this graph, which is actually amazing if you start to analyze the labor force survey. That agriculture, and that's this little green line, the farm workers. If we look at, and I've compared that with domestic workers, gardeners, construction, and hand packers. So in other words, all the primary jobs, unskilled jobs or relatively unskilled jobs, just to get a benchmark. If you look at agriculture in terms of paid leave, it's a sector that has grown the fastest, made the biggest contribution. So the sector is improving rapidly in terms of the conditions of farm workers. And look at UIF deductions, have written contracts, satisfied with jobs. That's the second set of bars there. Farm workers are actually at the highest level in terms of job satisfaction. And that has come despite of a rapidly rising wage rate. So that's the next graph. If we just look at the rate at which minimum wages have increased at the farm gate. So what the farming sector has done is it hasn't only maintained its labor force in spite of rapidly increasing minimum wages, it has also improved the condition of the farm workers. And I think we need to tell that story. That's a very important point that we need to raise. The reality, however, is that red line. By 2027, we'll have minimum wages or labor costs in the more intensive industries being the highest cost component at the farm. So costs are rising relatively fast compared to other costs. For example, fertilizer, expectation is that prices will come down. They are already coming down from their peaks of last year. Fuel, depending on the exchange rate, and energy as long as the war lasts, but certainly labor is going in one specific direction. So let's just quickly talk about our plan. The National Development Plan, and Bruce referred to that in 2011, 2012, when it was launched, there was a clear vision of the plan. What's the difference between the National Development Plan and the Master Plan? Because a lot of times we just make plans and where's the execution part? And I wanted to really invite you, and a lot of times when I hear there's criticism, if you read in the media about the Master Plan, it's not a perfect plan. No plan is ever perfect. But it's a good plan. If we just keep our eye on those pillars that the negotiation, the stakeholders have been working on for 2 years around the policy ambiguities and the creating an investment-friendly environment. If you look at the citrus plan, or that's what's come out of the fruit plan, there are very specific action in that plan, things that all stakeholders have agreed on. This is what we need to do. The same for creating an enabling infrastructure. So our transport team, if you want to know where to focus on and how to focus on, look at the master plan. The focus areas are in there, and the stakeholders have agreed to it. We've looked at our comprehensive farmer support programs, talked about it in detail, agreeing with private sector, with government, the extension services. How do we align with these activities? And I can go on with all the pillars. So I could really just encourage you, go and read the plan, because we need the effective implementation part. We need to take hands, we need to partner on it, and I think there are already many examples of this plan. I wanted to just quickly, and I'm trying to catch up on your time, John, just briefly mention the logic behind it. And again, it's coming back to, it's not only about the land, it's about the markets, it's about the value chains. So yes, we have land available. And that was nicely done by the ARC, where they mapped out the plus farms, and they clearly indicated how much land. In their assessment, they did about 1.8 million hectares. There was 230,000 hectares of field crop land that's relatively idle, where there can be activity. The same for horticulture, 84,000. Irrigation, about 50,000 hectares of irrigation currently that we can develop again. So a big opportunity for more land to get into production. But it's not only about the land, it's about the value chains. And that's what we did in the master plan, carefully assess how big are our markets. It's about the economic feasibility and competitiveness. Whether you're a small grower or a large commercial scale grower, we want to bring those markets that can actually be sustainable, can be competitive. And that's how the master plan has been crafted. So I just simply don't agree with people that say the master plan is not a market-orientated. It's a market-orientated plan. And the private sector, commercial, the industry organization, your Citrus Growers Association, have worked hard in identifying where the opportunities are. These are the markets that we need to open. And that's what the middle section is. So every value chain has been analyzed to say, that red button, that's a government activity. The blue button, that's what private sector needs to do. So there have been clear indications on who needs to do what. So I really encourage you, go and pick up your citrus or your fruit plan and have a look at it. Irrigation, I've talked about the irrigation, but obviously the electricity part, there's a lot more data that we're currently feeding into this process. These are strategic maps that we've developed for the energy crisis. So this is just irrigation spread of annual crops, and we do those for all the field crops. But this is just kind of heat maps. And on the left-hand side, that table indicates who the local municipalities are. So there will have to be some form of a negotiation and targeted approach, and understanding. If we understand where our hotspots are for irrigation and electricity, then we can at least work on a plan. Logistics. And this is just a soybean example, but it's the same principle that cuts across. If we are in the high fruit business or in the export or import business of grains and oilseeds. So just in short, what our struggle is, if we look at soybeans, for example, all our productions in the north, we have surpluses production of soybeans and meal in the north, but our transport is so expensive all the way down to the coast. So if you look at our importation of soya meal, the only reason why we're still importing is because it's too expensive to bring it from the north to Cape Town, that we're still importing from Argentina. There's no other reason for it. So if we could have our railing system more effective to hit the coastal lines, and that would be the same principle for the fruits also, the cheaper logistics, every little cent makes a difference in your global competitive world. Finances, we've talked about these many times in terms of blended finance. talked about a lot of those cross-cutting enablers in the master plan on blended finance. The point here is you have big extreme differences between your CapEx and OpEx. Your extensive livestock operation in the Karoo needs a different CapEx OpEx operation than obviously on the right-hand side where you need over R1 million a hectare. So those differences need to be taken into consideration, and we need to work at the blended finance. So government will run out of money if you have to invest in a R1 million a hectare operation. But we need to leverage that. And how can we leverage funds? How can we soften loans? Is through better information. So this is a roadmap to inclusive agriculture transformation. And currently where we're sitting at on the left-hand side is there are many institutions. There's a lot of activity going on, but there's little alignment. Here and there we start to align. So what we see in terms of the inclusive agriculture transformation part is better information, better alignment, better monitoring, that we know what we're measuring, that we're starting to, because the more we know also we reduce our risk, especially in terms of the blended financing part. And that's where the CGA already is doing work. So this is your dashboard where you're already capturing your black farmers, your new projects that are already happening, that you're already starting to monitor, to measure, to understand your progress. What are you measuring? I'm going to stop here. There are obviously all of these specific elements. My short message, my last message to you, go and have a look at the plan. It's a plan that can work. It has very specific activities, but it's really about the partnership between your industry and between government. Thank you very much.